You are listening to a Sustainable World Radio podcast. Sustainable World Radio brings you in-depth interviews, news, and commentary about positive solutions to environmental challenges. Solutions that adhere to the permaculture ethics of earth care, people care, fair share. Are you interested in learning more about permaculture projects around the globe? How to plant a food forest? Restorative design or ethnobotany? Then stay tuned for Sustainable World Radio. I'm your host and producer, Jill Cloutier. My guest today is Jason Fox. Jason is the owner of Vetiver Farms, Hawaii, located on the Big Island of Hawaii. Jason works and consults on vetiver projects around the globe and has won numerous awards for his work. Welcome to the program, Jason.
Hey, thank you.
Can you share with our listeners, we're going to be talking a lot about vetiver. Can you share with our listeners what initially drew you to growing this plant?
I was farming out here in Hawaii when I moved here about 10 years ago. I was working with a farmer and he was breaking up clumps and he started, I think he might have just mentioned the size of the root system, and that kind of perked my ears up a little bit. I guess I just did my own research and there wasn't a lot of info on the internet, but the Vetiver Network International has a great website. I started discovering how you could kind of undo mistakes of the past with it. And that was kind of what really sparked the fire for me and wanting to get involved with it, use it for wastewater treatment, phytoremediation, bioremediation, and then the obvious benefits with the root system for erosion control and slope stabilization.
So if people are tuning in right now and saying, okay, vetiver, what plant are we talking about? What's the Latin name for the plant that we're discussing today?
That's definitely important. It's Chrysopogon zizinoides. There's a few different cultivars of vetiver. There's only one that's approved to be in the Hawaiian Islands and Florida, California, the United States, and a lot of other countries that regulate invasive species, usually islands or most on top of that, use that cultivar specifically. In Hawaii, it's nicknamed Sunshine Vetiver. That nickname hasn't really picked up too much. People in Hawaii usually just say vetiver. However, there is cultivars in Thailand and India. Nemuralis specifically is a common one that have seeds that are viable. Zizinoides is a hybrid strain, which doesn't mean it's GMO. It just means it was selectively like an heirloom variety.
Are you using the Sunshine Vetiver because of an invasive quality to the other types of cultivars?
Yeah. So the Nemuralis is not extremely invasive, but it does have viable seeds. In order to use this plant with government agencies and whatnot, that's something to really be on point with, of not using something invasive. The Thai Vetiver Network, they use Nemuralis and they promote the use of it. There's a little bit of a discord there with them and the rest of vetiver users around the world, and specifically using Chrysopogon zizinoides. We'd usually just call it zizinoides or ziz. That cultivar has also been studied a lot more elaborately for its bioremediation uses, and all the scientific papers published around vetiver are using that species.
Where would we find vetiver in nature? Like, where does it like to grow?
It was originally native to Sri Lanka and India. The Sunshine cultivar was brought over to the United States by slaves that were working plantations in Sunshine, Louisiana. And that was where that's where that nickname Sunshine comes from today. They say it's one of the oldest plants on Earth, and a lot of its attributes demonstrate that, with being able to light it on fire and regenerate, and the aggressiveness of the root system and the tenacity of the plant in general. So as far as seeing it in nature, I've never had that experience. You would see it in nature. It's this non-invasive cultivar that we're using for bioengineering is not going to be found in nature because it's not invasive. You're going to see it on applications that people are using it for. And I would assume that the cultivars you would find in nature would be in India and Thailand and places where nemuralis was allowed to continue to propagate. I would believe it would be difficult to come across this cultivar in nature. I've never really thought about that. It's a good question. I'm curious myself to bounce that off of some of my mentors in the Vetiver network that might know the answer to that specifically. Because I would assume that you're never going to see it because it's, because it needs to be cared for and as a non-invasive plant.
And how long have humans and Vetiver been working together? How long have we been using Vetiver?
I don't know the first documentation of the plant. They say it was used around people's houses in India, and the plant's been real tied into their culture for a long time as far as the roots, medicinal uses. It's called khuskhus in India, and I think they even still today have a drink called khus, Khus, and they would put vetiver roots in their water, I guess, to filter their water with the roots. And they would also make blinds out of them and mist them because of its cooling effect, the roots, and put smudge bowls around. I guess graveyard is not the word I'm looking for in that culture, but what we would call a graveyard over there because it's supposed to help with mourning. It's very much tied into India's culture. As far as the United States and Hawaii, Hawaii brought vetiver here in 1995, the USDA did, for erosion control. So that's when it was introduced to the islands by the government. I know some people that had plants here prior to that. Australia is a huge promoter of vetiver. One of my colleagues has a lot of great plantings over there. A lot of Queensland has a big wastewater treatment plant that filters, I can't remember the numbers, but it's, basically a whole town's waste is run through fields of vetiver. A lot of Saudi Arabia and the Middle East has picked up a lot on vetiver. Vetiver kind of got its big name in the 1980s. A guy named Don Miller reforested the Vanuatu Mountains with using vetiver for soil traps, fire rejuvenation, and he used it to establish native acacia trees. I think it took them about 7 years of planting up in these gullies because their reefs had been destroyed from all the soil that was coming down from forest fires and man-made and natural reasons. And after they finished their work, it caught attention of the World Bank, and they started funding USAID and USDA to work with vetiver around the world. And then the King of Thailand also got involved, and they both, I think mainly the backer of the Vetiver Network International is the King of Thailand. Once that was created and a lot of the vetiver users were brought together, I'm kind of a younger guy in that group, so I'm hesitant to speak too much history on it, but I was just hanging out with all of them at the International Vetiver Conference, and I've tried to pick some of these guys' brains that are 75 years old, and they were the first guys in the game, and they kind of set the groundwork. And, there's a few of us youngsters trying to pick it up, and it's really cool to hear their stories from traveling around the globe and using this plant for real small communities. That's kind of where it's really a grassroots growing amazing plant that it's able to provide what we would think chemicals and sewers and cement and all these, elaborate contraptions with this simple plant. So it's real beautiful and hopeful as somebody younger to step in and look at these guys who dedicated their life to this plant and set that groundwork. And then, I stepped in only 8 years ago or so and was just so inspired and caught the vetiver bug and dedicated the last 8 years to just perpetuating the use of this plant in first world and has been easy over here. It's definitely a different ball game. A lot of people are drawn in government and community to use vetiver out of necessity, to clean water and to save soil. And it's interesting, me being from Hawaii and fighting the red tape I do over here, to interact with vetiver users around the globe who are using it in really righteous, awesome ways that are a little bit more out of necessity.
Reading your website and then doing some research on vetiver, I can see how it's so hopeful to be working with this plant. It has so many uses. We could talk for probably 4 hours about vetiver and all the things that it does. And one of the most amazing things that vetiver does, it's a bioremediation grass. And could you explain to listeners what that means, what is a bioremediation plant or phytoremediation, and then tell us what vetiver does, how it does that.
Phytoremediation is something that all plants do. They clean soil and water. Their threshold for toxicity varies greatly. Vetiver is unique in the sense that its threshold for heavy metals and high nitrate levels and high phosphate levels is substantially greater than any plant on the planet. That's why it's used for those applications. Bioremediation, the cleaning of water, is used with vetiver for wastewater treatment. So that's our waste. This is kind of where I got turned on to vetiver. Before I was working with this plant, I was working with aquariums, and I realized I had farming experience prior, and then I randomly took this aquarium job for a few years where you had to do a lot of water tests, and we had to work with coral reefs. The slightest spike in nitrate levels, just the slightest bit, will kill an invertebrate immediately, which is a coral reef, a living invertebrate. And then when you take that up even higher, you kill certain fish. And then when you take it up higher, you kill other fish. And saltwater tanks are just little micro examples of the environment. And it was pretty discouraging to work with this and realize that introducing absolutely no waste aside from what the fish are producing, using extensive mechanical filtration, you can wipe out a little ecosystem within that tank from increasing the nitrate and phosphate levels. So vetiver absorbs nitrate and phosphate on a great capacity. There's a lot of studies done on that it'll absorb up to 90% of nitrates and phosphates within these test examples that they did.
You were saying it can absorb nitrates, phosphates, and then these chemicals. So you mentioned coral reefs as well. So would the vetiver be planted between the rain runoff and the ocean? Or how would you plant vetiver to help coral reefs?
So the work they did in Vanuatu is the smarter way to address the problem up the mountain, where they're trapping sediment at the source. You can, do the Band-Aid approach and address it down at the ocean, which is helpful a lot of times, but it's kind of a more broad spectrum approach to what community you're in and how you would use it to absorb sediment, protect coral reefs. For me out in Hawaii, there's a lot of golf courses that are all over our oceans. They're right on the ocean everywhere, and they throw tons of high nitrogen level to keep their grasses green. The greens especially are always on the water. And I've pondered on how to skin that cat, because when you go to a golf course and ask them, hey, I want to put vetiver here, you guys are non-pointing finger kind of way of explaining to them its ability to absorb the fertilizers that they're putting down, and it's also going to act as a biofilter from everything else above it that's running down and exiting at that point. They're not wanting to own up or acknowledge that they're doing that, and that's been the story that they've been sticking with since people started noticing that the coral reefs were dying around golf courses and things like that. It's not just golf courses, but as far as protecting coral reefs, on my experience here, I haven't been able to do it nearly as much as I want. The common planting that we do is for homeowners that live on ocean cliffs, or not even a cliff, a small bluff or a sandy berm, or, they're usually homeowners that are on the ocean that want to protect their land.
I read that vetiver is also called organic glue and living steel. Can you explain why and how it is used for slope stabilization?
That's the easiest thing to do with vetiver is trap soil and slope stabilization and erosion control. It's a really hardy plant. It's pretty sensitive to Roundup, and you can remove it with a shovel if you want to, but it's a ancient grass that's been around. The plant has a 12 to 15 foot root system, and it's called those nicknames and, living steel, soil nails. I haven't heard that glue one. I like that. But glue to me is on the surface, and this is a real deep, synergistic, environmental. It's working with everything around it, and it's not, when you use cement or some of these rigid steel things to hold soil and land back from eroding. This plant, the root system's going 12 to 15 foot deep, and each root has megapixel rating of 75, which is how they rate tensile strength.
Wow.
Of something. So when you combine one plant, which is in the same family as lemongrass, so a lot of people are familiar with that one a little bit more. It's a clumping grass. When you combine these hedgerows of vetiver, which usually for slope stabilization, they're planted 2 to 3 feet apart, the rows are, and the plants 4 to 6 inches apart. When those all lock up together, each hedgerow is equivalent to a 4-inch steel plate that's 12 feet deep, 12 to 15 feet deep. So when you insert those steel plate hedgerows, just a really beefy, I'll go onto sites where if I walked on the soil would fall from under my feet and I would fall down the cliff, and then we plant the vetiver and come back there in a year or two, and it'll start to self-terrace itself over time. It's able to have dirt go on top of it and send up new shoots. If that does happen at all from anywhere above, it'll just kind of continue to self-terrace, and eventually it'll change the entire grade of a land over 50 years or so. And there's some cool pictures with that about showing vetiver hedgerows that'll live 100. I think the oldest plants we know about are 150 years old or something around there. So it's really just the concrete thing, especially when you're on an island, is a common one for retaining walls and steel. And these things are created off island, and they're just environmental disasters and what's involved that goes into that. And then you live in a place that has earthquakes, and a wave energy comes at it and cracks it, and it's done. Or it's going to last 20, 30 years, 40 years the most, and it's going to cost, they say, 80% more than a properly done vetiver application would be. The scientific bioremediation, phytoremediation, when you get into absorbing heavy metals, then that's a little bit of a different ball game, and it can absorb, and when I say absorb, I mean lock within the root systems, mercury, cadmium, selenium, zinc, arsenic, and it has the capacity to withhold high levels of this, lead, one I forgot, and it locks it within its root system so that it can't transfer it to any other places. So certain compounds, it's going to help change the molecular structure, but most of them, it's not going to change its form. It's going to trap it and hold it in the roots. A lot of people ask with that question is, so say you're in a toxic environment and we're not going to change something's form. We're going to just keep it there so it doesn't go into our food source and our water source. Are the cows going to eat it, or the goats, or sheep or whatever, horses? Because it is a forage crop, and that's something that it's used for a lot in Africa and Middle East, places with low rainfall. I think it's 0.03 is the number that comes up in, so it's a real small trace amount that'll come up into the leaves of the plant. It's going to really just lock it within its root system and keep it there.
Do the roots absorb it?
Yeah,
So the roots are taking it
yeah,
up in the plant. Okay.
correct.
So it's safe to
But
eat.
locking
Yeah.
it in there. It's safe for livestock. I mean, that's all relative to, what kind of levels of something you're dealing with and what that is.
Yes, because it is really phenomenal. So, what you were saying earlier about the erosion control is it really, Vetiver sounds like it could be a living infrastructure, which would help us with the cost of rebuilding our infrastructure for instead of the concrete and steel.
Yeah, and then you don't have to rebuild it in your lifetime.
This is like a living infrastructure. It would last for a long time. It's cheaper than using what we're using for many things. It does slope stabilization and erosion. It helps offset that. And then also wastewater treatment. So there are places, it sounds like, around the world where people are using this in wastewater treatment. What about lakes and rivers and cleaning those up? Is anyone doing that with vetiver?
Yeah, you can use it for freshwater applications. There's different ways to treat a common wastewater treatment as a constructed wetland. And you can also use it in pontoon rafts, which is where you would grow the vetiver hydroponically and float rafts into affluent areas or algae bloom, whatever the situation may be. And the vetiver will absorb toxicity, heavy metals, phosphate, nitrate levels, and act as a cleaner grass for standing bodies of water as well. And they can be flowing. It's a little trickier when the water is not dirty because it likes to have the nutrients to thrive on. There's some great work. Australia has a lot of pontoon applications. I just saw some really neat ones in the Philippines. My colleague, Noah, Vetiver Farms Philippines, she's doing some really cool work down there. They're just blowing up with vetiver users.
You also mentioned how the roots will absorb wave energy. This would be helpful in earthquakes. So, what would people do to help with that? Plant it around their house? And then I think it's also fire resistant as well.
It is. It also repels subterranean termites and roots. There's a few studies that were done on that. Yeah, it absorbs wave energy if it's planted around your house. That's not something I usually speak too much about the homeowners because it's just kind of an added bonus of when they're on a hillside and they're planting vetiver around their home. You just imagine when we all look at the ground and it's like looking at water, you can't see what's underneath it. And if you kind of look at it with that underneath shot, which is not something people do with soil because you can't jump in it like you can't water, I guess. That's how my brain works with working with this plant for so long. Is that's what I'm always seeing is what's underground and the water and flows and things like that. And a lot of our buildings and homes, we wait till these hurricanes come in or these landslides that kill communities and they're devastating, and we don't think about it until it happens. And we're in hurricane season right now out here, and I'm thinking about everybody out there in the community as these hurricanes come in because I drive by their houses every day and notice they're sitting on fluff, nothing. It'll absorb wave energy, and also the most important aspect of that of just stabilizing the soil that's most commonly planted with a grass with a 6-inch root system or a tree that's just a bunch of tubes that kind of stretch horizontally across the surface, and then you have this plant that goes 12 to 15 feet deep in an intertwined web of root and steel, per se, that's just game changer for holding people's homes they've built and their livelihoods. And it'd be great to see it being used more because nobody really knows about it.
Mm-hmm. In the wastewater treatment aspect of it as well, is it used at landfills to treat the leachate?
That's been my big mission aside from slope stabilization is going after landfills. I've only got one so far in Hawaii, and I really want to get the Hilo landfill here because it doesn't have a liner and it's over capacity and they're trucking leachates out. And then on Maui, they have these injection wells, and there's just if people knew what was going on and the same thing with the wastewater, it's not something anybody thinks about or talks about, but it's gnarly. On Hilo, it drains through Hawaiian homelands into Keaukaha, which is where all the beaches are that we all swim in. And it's such a rainy area that they have a hard time testing proving this. So I really want to get it where the farm is based out of Hilo, and it's going to absorb a lot of it. And we throw batteries. And I mean, you can imagine when you accumulate an entire town's trash, the kind of seepage that creates when there's no oxygen in the environment, nothing's breaking down. Even these biodegradable cups that we're using, there's no oxygen present. They're staying the way they are. And everything's just leaching its seepage of down into the groundwater and going into the ocean, where there probably was some pretty beautiful coral reefs. I got off track with just the landfill. So it's absorbing, heavy metals that I mentioned earlier, and keeping them, it'll lock them in the roots and keep them from going into the ocean or the waterways. So I just drew up some plans for our community landfill to plan it around the landfill and act as a seepage barrier. And there's a lot of different ways you can address landfill, leachate, seepage, and runoff treatment. Most places in first world have liners on the bottom of it, and they collect the leachate, and then you can really effectively treat it that way, like they did in Biloxi, Mississippi. BM Waste Management has a big vetiver planting over there that saves their community. I forget the numbers. I want to say millions. It was real high numbers every year that they're saving from trucking off leachates, which is what most people do, or treating them in conventional fashion rather than just trusting this plant to absorb them. So obviously it's using less trash, but there's always going to be some there.
That's great to know that they're actually using it at some landfills, because that is a big problem. We call it trash juice when we teach the little kids. It's like all that yucky trash juice. Yuck. Well, you mentioned how long the roots are in vetiver, and that led me to think that it would be a really good carbon sequestration tool. Can you share with our listeners if that's true, and how, if it does sequester a lot of carbon?
It does. Where was it? They just did a big planting. It was in an Asian city. I want to maybe like Seoul, Korea, something began with an F, to sink carbon. So it's tree per se sinks more carbon than a single vetiver plant, but you can fit more vetiver plants on a hectare, an acre of land than you can trees. I don't have the number off the top of my head about how many pounds of carbon you sink per plant.
I actually have it right here. I think.
Is it 3 something?
It's per plant, per mature plant, it's 2.5. Is it kilograms?
Okay.
Is that kg?
Yeah.
Okay. And then in a meter, it's 15 kg. In a kilometer, it's 15 tons. And I think I got this off your website. In a hectare, it's 150 tons of carbon. Supposedly. This was a study done, which is huge.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's an added benefit.
You add the other benefits, and it's great.
And it also increases soil fertility and improves pastures. And is that just because the roots are kind of mining up the nutrients, or how would it increase soil fertility? Holding it down, I guess.
Yeah, you're saving and holding the soil together, and you're also bringing up micronutrients with the mulch, or providing it to your livestock in the soil. Granted, your pasture is not contaminated, and you're not working on an old sugarcane land, which is something that's common out here. The main way I see it improving pasture is through moving water, and that's another aspect that I fell in love with vetiver for, is its ability to move water. When I saw that in action, I was just so impressed that you can take these seasonal streams that create flooding usually and use it to regenerate your field. So, if you have a large pasture, which is extremely common, that you want more rainfall in your pasture and you want it in certain areas, and you plant hedgerows so that water runoff is dispersed and you're contouring your land and such to provide more water to it, that's really the benefit that I see ranchers actually implementing and seeing good results from. Because soil fertility, holding the soil, obvious, but the holding the soil, obvious. The soil fertility, there's a lot of other things you can do to improve your pasture. There's some guys making Palm Valley Farms just up the street from me. They're taking all the fish emulsion from our sushi market and creating a fish hydrolysate out of it. That's a really great product. It's just the most sustainable thing you can do on an island to bring fertility. So vetiver's application is more based around, for pasture improvement, around moving water, and that's how I first got involved with it. I was growing taro, and my taro patches, dryland taro, they were getting flooded out every winter by runoff from a road that was above, and we dug out a little contour and planted vetiver around it and completely moved this stream that was washing out our gardens. It helped us to grow more food, and that's a real common application in third world and hopefully soon in first world. Is, they should think of a new name rather than the 1, 2, 3 aspect, because I'm not feeling too number one over here in some ways.
The 2/3 world? That's what my friend says. So water movement. And so are you planting them like on berms and swales?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's how I did it. When I said I dug up an area and created a raised bed and planted the vetiver in there, and it locked it in. You don't even need to do that, though. I wouldn't have done that. That was my first planting. It depends on what kind of water flow you're dealing with. If you would want to raise it up as much as you want for however high your water level is. Usually rain and runoff sites are mitigated with the first 6 inches above ground, which the vetiver plant provides as its acting attribute to disperse that water depending on how you contour it. I think the only, I don't know, maybe you keep reminding me of uses, but the mulch is actually really good to have around the garden too, once you are using it for either a weed barrier, for something, say you have something like Wanaka grass that runs underground and you want to have a hedgerow on the outside. So it's going to provide insect trap through the vetiver blades of grass. And then when you mulch it, the mycorrhiza in vetiver is really high. And anytime you mulch with it anywhere, you have a whole nice little patty of white bacteria growing, and it's kind of a nice little natural IMO action when you use the tops of the plants, because it's a real hardy kind of blade of grass, almost like palm frond, similar to that.
That was one thing I did not read about in my research. So the mulch is it's valuable.
It is, yeah. They do thatch roof out of it, and they weave baskets, and there's people that make ropes out of it. It's just at a craft show with it, and they got all sorts of cool little things they were making with it.
And does the grass, do the blades, or what would you call it? Is it blades? The leaves, do they smell? Are they aromatic? Well, what part is used for essential oil making?
Yeah, they aren't aromatic.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes people walk by the plants and they're like, oh, I smell it, because it's just in their mind, because they think, vetiver. But yeah, it's in the roots. They smell good. That's another. We use all parts of the plant in our process. So when we dig out these plants to plant them elsewhere, we also harvest the roots and make an essential oil and smudge sticks and bracelets and things like that out of the roots when we propagate out.
Yeah, I loved on your website it said hand and hoof crafted essential oils.
Yeah, that's our. The sheep really hold it down. That's super blessed to work with them and have them as a teammate, because they like a lot of other grasses out here. So they're, with timely rotation, they can help keep weeds down from new vetiver plantings, which is real key when you're trying to grow a lot of something and have some help with weeding organically.
If the vetiver absorbs heavy metals, and this kind of goes back to a question earlier, and some antibiotics and these different metals we don't want to be consuming, should consumers be very careful where they get their essential oil, their vetiver essential oil?
Yeah, that's something that, you definitely want to be conscious of getting your vetiver essential oil from somebody who has done soil tests and preferably already grown vetiver in that same spot to absorb anything it was going to absorb.
And then what is the essential oil used for?
They use it mainstream in perfumes as the base note. You're never really going to catch that on Chanel and Calvin Klein, a lot of those kind of things. We make the essential oil, and most people use it to dispel fear and anxiety and to stay grounded, obviously. And that's definitely the medicine that I've noticed with it, is you're interacting with the plant that's been sunk in the earth for up to 2 years is usually when you get your highest oil yield. So it's been taking that in, and then you're interacting with it. So the grounding is something I tune into. They also say it's good for blood circulation and antimicrobial, antibacterial. And there's a lot of, I don't really get too into the medicinal uses of it that we don't share as an individual with it, because it'll even have a different scent on different people's skin. So it's just kind of whatever it does for you. But oil's great. Ours is, we don't make a lot of it, but it's really unique, and we use a little copper still, so it comes out green, and it's just a real special little side bonus to working with the plant, is having this nice smelly oil to interact with and tune into the plant with.
Oh, that's great. And so we're getting to the end of our time, and I'm wondering, for people who are really excited about growing this plant, how can they get started? Is it easy to find, and how do they plant it?
It depends where they are. You can go on vetiver.org, and they'll have plant suppliers in your area. That site's not really up to date, and I give people direction all the time, because our presence online with, if they're in some random place and they want to know, they can contact me, and I'm happy to tell them who's somebody local in their area.
How can they find you?
Our website's vetiverfarmshawaii.com. We also have the Facebook, the Vetiver Solution, and the Instagram, Vetiver Farms Hawaii. We're happy to direct anybody to plants, and we try to provide plants to anybody in Hawaii. There's, I think, another distributor. There's two more distributors throughout the Hawaiian Islands, but I don't know that they grow organically. And part of us making the essential oil out of it is we're able to provide plants to people from about half the cost that they can get from somebody else. So we like to get it out there. I want to spread as many vetiver plants around as we can, have people have that tool in their tool bag for their land or their house, or whatever it may be.
How long does it take for a vetiver plant to reach maturity?
About a year to 2 years it'll take to reach maturity. When you're using it for applications, it can kind of vary on what you want to call maturity, what action you're looking for to try and mitigate. But out in your yard for propagation purposes or so, 6 months to a year. But the longer you let it sit in the ground, the harder it's going to be to dig up. And it's no joke digging up those plants. You don't have to obviously go all to the bottom of the root system, but they want to be in the soil where they are.
Is it like bamboo? My friend was trying to dig up some bamboo in our yard to take home, and it was probably an hour of intense sweating, red face, trying with all his might, and he didn't budge it.
Yeah, it's pretty similar to that, for sure.
Well, so is that one of the only, because we've talked about all these amazing benefits, is that, like, once it's in the ground, it likes to be in the ground? Is that one of the only drawbacks of planting vetiver? Or are there any others that come to mind?
Drawbacks, it's sharp. The blades of the grass are similar to lemongrass, where they kind of just have a little bit of an edge to them. So they're not something you want your kids running around in or anything like that. But other than that, that's my only complaint with the plant, is it's hard as hell to get out of the ground, and it's a little sharp on the edges. But yeah, I haven't run into any drawbacks with it aside from that.
For those listeners who may be in a colder climate, what is the most cold that vetiver can stand? What climate does it like? It sounds like tropical or subtropical.
Yep, they're pushing that. We're trying to, I think the highest planting we have in Hawaii is at 4,000 feet. And generally, you don't want it to have a frost for longer than a few days. They grow it in Mississippi and Louisiana, and so they're using it in southern areas in the United States and Southern California. Anywhere down south can use the plant. You just don't want it to have a frost for more than a few days, and you kind of got to be a little bit knowledgeable of the plant, how to, you can help it along with the frost, burning it before the dormant season and putting shade cloth over it and things like that. So I've heard that help it get through the winter. But yeah, subtropical, tropical, it's game on with it. It likes full sun. You're going to get the most root growth, and that's its preference. So it's not going to like full shade, but a little bit of shade it can definitely handle.
So Jason, thank you so much for spending time with us today and educating all of us about vetiver. And is there anything I didn't ask you that you want to share with listeners today?
People can feel free to contact me and talk story about vetiver. Yeah, I'm happy to talk with anybody more about it. It's a passion of mine, and love to be of service with any kind of projects people have going on or any ideas and things like that.
That was great. And so that people can reach you at vetiverfarmshawaii.com. And there's a contact. I think they can contact you there if you have any questions about vetiver. And thank you so much. This has been very enlightening, and I love vetiver now.
Thank you. I'm glad to hear and share the plant's uses with you. It's cool to talk to you about it.
You've been listening to a Sustainable World Radio podcast. You can find us online at sustainableworldradio.com and also on iTunes. For more information about permaculture and ecology, visit the Sustainable World Media YouTube channel, where you'll find videos about permaculture, aquaponics, organic gardening, rainwater harvesting, and much, much more. Sustainable World Radio is a listener-supported program. If you like what we do, please consider making a donation to the show. I'm your host and producer, Jill Cloutier, and thank you so much for listening.